Hello Planetmans! Today we'll talk about flags. I'll approach the topic from three perspectives. The first one is the historical perspective. Planetside is not the first game to introduce capture the flag mechanics, but it's not particularly successful. So why did it work better in other games? The second perspective is comparison of the current conduit mechanics with capture point mechanics. How does the gameplay change if you convert a base? The third perspective is the currently proposed changes to conduits that are available on the test server as of shooting of this video. What do they fix and what do they break? Unreal Tournament is one of classic arena shooters that included a capture the flag mode. It's different in many ways, but Planetside retains many of the old school flag carrying mechanics. You can pick up an enemy flag, if you die you drop it. The enemy can return their dropped flag by touching it. Your side can pick up a dropped enemy flag again. If nobody picks up a flag for a while, it returns on its own. This allows the game to continue even if a flag ends up in an unreachable location. In Planetside, the flag also returns if carried for a long time. This prevents bad actors from breaking the game. In a lobby arena shooter, you just won't kick a person like that. In some games, including Planetside, you can drop or throw the flag without dying. In Unreal, you drop the flag if you use the translocator, but server settings may disallow translocators. Arena shooters disagree how carrying a flag limits the player's abilities. Most games allow flag carriers to shoot. Most Halos made you hold the flag with both hands, just like Planetside, so you couldn't fire any weapon, but you could drop it. That said, I have watched a few Halo CTF videos and flag carriers almost never try to fight back. It doesn't happen much in Planetside either, because even if you win a 1v1 with the odds stacked against you, that still gives other enemies an opportunity to catch up. Halo 4 allowed flag carriers to hold a flag in one hand and a sidearm in the other, but it imposed other limits. The Halo series actually experimented with the rules quite a bit. For example, in Halo 4 you can't return a dropped flag. You have to prevent enemies from touching it until it times out. Eventually Halo Infinite made flag carriers hold the flag with both hands again. All the mentioned games so far implemented only the original mirror match style of CTF. Both teams own a flag and are trying to steal the enemy's flag while defending their own. Even Team Fortress 2, often objective-based asymmetric game, opted for mirror match CTF. But I do know one game that pulled off asymmetric attack-defend type CTF quite successfully. A return to Castle Wolfenstein and its free follow-up, Wolfenstein Enemy Territory. Enemy Territory shipped only with objective-based attack-defend maps. Attackers would have limited time to achieve the objective and secure victory. Defenders just had to delay them and run out of the clock. Two of the original maps included an objective to steal a flag equivalent items. Since the defender victory condition is always to run out of the clock, there was no need to invent a repository-like game mechanic. The map just designates a drop-off location and the attackers can focus on stealing the objective. They don't need to split their force to hold the repository at the same time. In a server-based game with forced team balance, putting additional defense burden on attackers would make the map too defensive, which is basically what we see in Planetside. I have not found any other asymmetric CTF games similar to Planetside 2. I have probably missed some, so that's one way you can use the comment section of this video. Capture point comparison. The difference between conduit and capture point gameplay in the current iteration depends a lot on how many objectives are in the base. A single capture point is a single objective to hold. CTF involves at minimum two objectives, a conduit and a repository. This means that if you convert a single capture point base into a conduit base, you likely split the attacker force and make them vulnerable to defeat in detail. But the placement of the objectives also matters, so if the repo is moved to a more attacker-friendly location and the conduit podium isn't too defensible, it may just barely work. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. But when we consider 3 or more capture point bases, it somewhat reverses the difference between capture point and CTF. With the exception of Osher's Excavian, Attackers need to hold all capture points in order to have a reasonable capture time. But with flags, they just need one repository and then steal the conduits. Attackers may theoretically be able to outmaneuver defenders with equal population, provided that, again, the conduit podiums are not too defensible for defenders. Spoiler alert, they usually are too defensible. PTS Conduit Changes. The PTS changes shift conduits into hybrid CTF/control point mode. The repositories act as control points in respect to the capture timer, but repositories held by the home faction may only be flipped by delivering a conduit. Neutral repositories or tools held by attackers can be flipped just like any other capture point. The flip progress is much slower, probably to prevent a single infill from ruining your base capture. Conduits can also be delivered to flipped repositories to accelerate the capture by fixed duration. In bases with a single conduit and a single repository, the attackers can focus their force now, initially on the conduit and then transition to the repository. Since attacks usually start with overwhelming force on the attacker side, this essentially boils down to a point hold, albeit with longer capture time than usual. If attackers maintain overpop, they may accelerate it by stealing more conduits. If the defenders liberate the repository, then it's mostly over since attackers probably can't mount a successful push for conduit at that point. But given how long it takes to flip a repository, it will be probably over in a capture point base just as well. Overall, this seems to be a good change to me, though it renders conduit somewhat secondary, pointless. In bases with multiple repositories, we end up with entirely different dynamics. Even in the face of slight overpop, defenders are usually able to concentrate on a single point and liberate it. In a capture point base, it tends to turn into a whack-a-mole. But in a CTF base, the attackers have to steal a conduit to flip a repository, so in a whack-a-mole scenario, they have significantly harder task, especially considering where conduit podiums tend to be placed. Simply put, attackers have to go through a lot more trouble to capture a conduit large base with the proposed changes compared to a control point large base. That's not good, considering large control point bases are usually quite defensible to begin with. I can think of one way to improve this. Repository capture timer math could be modified to make defender repositories count only if the defenders hold all of them. So if attacker holds one repository out of 3, the timer would advance at 1/3 speed in their favor. If they hold 2, it would advance at 2/3 speed. This way, nothing would change for single repository bases. Conduit podium placement. I think the biggest issue with CTF is that it requires much more careful base design. If you give Planetmans a spawn solution and a point to hold in a building, then they will do a decent job. But holding multiple points is an entirely different beast. The conduit podium's locations tend to be defensible buildings, and therefore they will be held by someone. This essentially adds another location to hold. Such arrangement may work in classic arena shooters because it's a mirror match, and you just won't see many points scored. It works in enemy territory because the attackers can focus their force and players are surprisingly mobile. That game has more in common with Quake than with Call of Duty. For Planetside, I think conduit podiums should be placed in a no man's land impassable for vehicles. I want to see tactical use of smoke and infiltrators sacrificing themselves to push the flag 3 steps toward the repository. Not gonna lie, I just want to see a lot of dead infiltrators. Perhaps my most profound realization is that it's very tough to design good bases when you don't have reliable feedback. In a lobby-based game, it doesn't matter that some maps are bad, as long as they don't drown out the good ones. Devs can then just check which maps are popular. But in Planetside, lattice greatly limits the options, and for some commanders, ambition has priority over fun. Circumstances like population magnitude, population balance, attack direction, player characteristics, etc. also greatly affect the results. I think devs should allow players rate each battle and collect not only the votes, but also the circumstances. Conduit carriers. Most games allow flag carriers to defend themselves and do not reveal them on the minimap. They also reward them adequately. Absent persistent progression, just knowing you have meaningfully, if not majorly, contributed to your team's performance is a reward enough. But in Planetside, there is persistent progression and you get measly 100 XP. Anyone who pushed a flag toward the repository should get a share of at least 500 experience. You get 750 for a generated destruction, which is oftentimes irrelevant to base capture. If flag carriers are disarmed and revealed on the minimap, they deserve more. But I'd rather unnerf them instead. The game already has a decent intelligence system, particularly the spotting feature. That's all I have. Hopefully the flag update will fix a major pain point of the game. I guess I'll see you next time. Yeah, this paper is full of topics.
Red team scores. Flawless victory.